September 22, 1945. Camp Deming, New Mexico. Georg Gärtner, a 24-year-old sergeant from Rommel's Africa Corps, crawled under 2 fence lines in the desert darkness. For weeks he had studied the schedule of freight trains that passed near the camp. Tonight he would board one headed west, beginning what would become a 40-year odyssey as America's last fugitive prisoner of war. Gärtner was born in Schweidnitz, Lower Silesia. His hometown no longer existed as part of Germany. It had been ceded to Poland under the Potsdam Agreement. To return meant facing Soviet occupation, potential execution, or Siberian labour camps. As he sprinted toward the railroad tracks, he wasn't just escaping a prison camp. He was choosing America over a homeland that had ceased to exist. Across 511 POW camps from Maine to California, 371,683 German prisoners faced the same calculation. Official U.S. Army records document 2,222 escape attempts. When final repatriation concluded, 7 prisoners could not be accounted for. Thousands more would resist through legal channels, work slowdowns, and deliberate delays. By 1946, American military forces would resort to armed intervention to force the final resistors onto ships bound for Europe. The mathematics of desperation were being written not in military strategy, but in individual choices, between Soviet persecution and American imprisonment, between starvation in Germany and illegal freedom in America, between certain death in communist territories and the uncertain future as fugitives in the nation they had fought against. The transformation began on May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. For the 371,683 German prisoners of war held in American camps, the war was over. But for approximately 123,000 POWs, whose homes now lay in Soviet-occupied territories, or lands ceded to Poland, the nightmare was just beginning. The Geneva Convention's Article 75 mandated rapid repatriation after hostilities ceased. But the U.S. State Department, in documents later declassified, acknowledged a crisis. These prisoners originated from territories now under Soviet control. East Prussia had become Russian. Silesia and Pomerania were now Polish. The Sudetenland belonged to Czechoslovakia. These men had no Germany to return to. By July 1945, camp commanders across America reported increasing incidents of what military psychiatrists documented as severe anxiety disorders among prisoners facing repatriation. The U.S. military would eventually execute 14 German POWs for murdering fellow prisoners suspected of cooperating with authorities. Dozens more suicides were likely murders committed by prisoners who believed their victims were betraying the resistance to repatriation. The most organized resistance would emerge at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where the U.S. Army's attempt to screen prisoners for Nazi sympathies would trigger the largest organized opposition to repatriation in American military history. January 6, 1946. Fort Eustis, Virginia. What began as a repatriation processing center became the epicenter of systematic resistance. According to official U.S. military records, Fort Eustis processed 22,000 German POWs through a controversial 6-day democracy course that would determine their fate. The screening system divided prisoners into 3 categories: white, anti-Nazi; grey, politically neutral; and black, committed Nazi. Those classified as black faced 2 to 3 additional years of forced labour in Britain or France before repatriation. Those deemed white could return directly to Germany. The classification process created immediate resistance. Prisoners discovered they could trade classifications. White classified prisoners sold their identities to black classified officers for cigarettes and chocolate. The scheme collapsed when age and rank discrepancies became obvious during final processing. Lieutenant Colonel Alpheus Smith, who had run similar programs at Fort Getty, Rhode Island, received the Legion of Merit for his work. But even he acknowledged the system's contradictions. The program asked prisoners to attend democracy lectures while keeping them imprisoned indefinitely, an irony not lost on the prisoners themselves. By February 1946, resistance at Fort Eustis had evolved into organised passive resistance. Prisoners destroyed identification papers, claiming they couldn't be repatriated without proper documentation. Mass illness reports overwhelmed medical facilities. The camp hospital, designed for routine medical care, reported 10 times normal capacity as prisoners exhibited symptoms preventing travel. To understand the desperation driving resistance, one must examine the most elaborate escape attempt in American POW history, the Great Papago Escape of December 24, 1944. Camp Papago Park in Arizona housed 3,100 German prisoners, primarily naval personnel. Among them was Captain Zur See Jürgen Wattenberg, commander of U-162. The escape plan took 3 months to execute. 25 prisoners dug a 178-foot tunnel from the bathhouse to beyond the perimeter fence. They dispersed 30 tons of excavated dirt by constructing an unnecessary volleyball court, telling guards they needed to level the ground. On Christmas Eve, while guards attended holiday celebrations and prisoners staged a diversionary party, 25 officers escaped through the tunnel. Their destination revealed their intentions, not Germany, but Mexico, which they hoped would provide sanctuary. The escape's aftermath demonstrated the futility of flight in America. Wattenberg was recaptured on January 28, 1945, after a Phoenix resident reported a suspicious man asking directions to Mexico in accented English. 3 U-boat officers were found after 3 days sitting in a Phoenix park, having discovered Arizona's rivers existed mostly on maps. The punishment, bread and water for days equal to time at large. Of all escape attempts, only Georg Gärtner succeeded completely. After his September 22, 1945 escape from Camp Deming, he caught a freight train to California. For the next 40 years he lived as Dennis F. Wiles, a name chosen from a migrant farm family he travelled with from Arkansas. Gärtner worked as a dishwasher, lumberjack, ski instructor at Sugar Bowl in Tahoe, and tennis professional. He obtained a Social Security card, married Jean Clark in 1964, and adopted her 2 children. He eventually became a construction estimator and architectural consultant, building custom homes across Southern California. The FBI maintained him on their wanted list, issuing posters to 10,000 post offices. J. Edgar Hoover personally signed his arrest warrant. Yet Gärtner lived openly. In January 1952, he joined a ski expedition to rescue the city of San Francisco train, stranded in a Sierra Nevada blizzard. Life magazine photographed the rescue team, including Gärtner, while FBI wanted posters hung in nearby post offices. In 1984, after his wife threatened to leave him over his refusal to discuss his past, Gärtner confessed. The following year, he contacted historian Arnold Kramer and co-authored Hitler's Last Soldier in America. On September 11, 1985, he surrendered to Bryant Gumbel on NBC's Today Show. The government faced a legal impossibility. Gärtner couldn't be prosecuted for escape. It wasn't a federal crime. He couldn't be deported. He'd been brought to America against his will. He couldn't be charged with illegal entry. He'd never technically entered. The FBI announced it had no further interest. The Immigration and Naturalization Service confirmed no interest in deportation. In November 2009, at age 88, Gärtner finally became an American citizen in Denver. He died in Loveland, Colorado, in 2013, having lived 68 years in the country he was supposed to have been expelled from in 1945. While prisoners resisted repatriation, American farmers and businesses fought to keep them. The statistics were compelling. German POWs had harvested 939 million pounds of vegetables in 1945, picked 568 million pounds of fruit, and generated $230 million in agricultural value at wages of 80 cents per day paid to the US government. Congressional records from February 1945 show politicians from rural states requesting 100,000 additional POW laborers. The Great Western Sugar Company formally petitioned Congress to retain 3,121 German POWs indefinitely. In Idaho, J.R. Simplot Company, which would later supply McDonald's French fries, employed 2,000 German prisoners in dehydrated potato factories that fed American forces in the Pacific. Labor unions provided fierce opposition. The Congress of Industrial Organizations and American Federation of Labor published advertisements showing returning GIs unable to find work, while German prisoners of war labored in American fields. Union leaders called it a betrayal of veterans to employ former enemies, while American soldiers remained unemployed. The conflict between agricultural necessity and organized labor created strange political alliances. Southern senators sided with Midwestern farmers against Northern industrial unions. The Farm Bureau Federation opposed the American Legion. The War Manpower Commission's requirement for union participation in worker recruitment collided with farmers' desperate need for labor. Military regulations strictly prohibited fraternization between American personnel and POWs, threatening court-martial for violators. Despite this, the most documented case involved Second Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, an African-American Army nurse, and Frederick Albert, a German Wehrmacht medic. They met at Camp Florence, Arizona, in 1944. Powell was one of only 63 black nurses in the Army Nurse Corps, assigned to POW wards because military leadership believed racial prejudice would prevent fraternization. When Albert received repatriation orders in March 1946, Powell was pregnant. Using his American-born child as legal grounds, Albert successfully applied for immigration and returned in 1947. They married on June 26, 1947 in Manhattan, one of 16 states permitting interracial marriage. Barbara Schmitter-Heisler's research, published in From German Prisoner of War to American Citizen, 2013, documents that approximately 5,000 former POWs eventually emigrated to America, with an estimated 1,200 marrying American women. The military's deliberate suppression of these statistics makes precise numbers impossible to determine. The terror-driving resistance had a documented cause: Operation Keelhaul. Conducted between August 14, 1946 and May 9, 1947, this operation forcibly returned 2.75 million Soviet nationals from Western Allied zones. American intelligence later estimated 50% were either executed or sent to Siberian labor camps. The McNarney-Clark Directive, signed by American commanders, explicitly stated that individuals could be repatriated without regard to their wishes and by force if necessary. This directive, classified until 1975, proved that forced repatriation wasn't limited to Soviet citizens. German POWs from eastern territories witnessed these forced repatriations. At Camp Shanks, New York, they watched through fences as Soviet prisoners were dragged to trains. Some Soviet prisoners committed suicide rather than face repatriation. These scenes convinced German POWs from Soviet-occupied territories that escape or resistance offered their only chance for survival. The Supreme Court case Johnson v. Eisentrager, 1950, established that German nationals held by American forces had no access to U.S. courts for habeas corpus petitions. This retroactively validated the military's position that POWs had no legal recourse to challenge repatriation. Congressional records show extensive debate about retaining POW labor. In February 1945, representatives from agricultural states formally requested retention of 100,000 German POWs. However, these requests focused on extending detention for labor purposes rather than granting residency rights. The State Department's reclassification of German prisoners as surrendered enemy personnel or disarmed enemy forces in June 1945 avoided Geneva Convention protections. This allowed extended detention for labor while technically complying with international law. Military records document 56 official suicides among German POWs between 1943 and 1946. The International Red Cross, investigating conditions in American POW camps, reported in March 1946 that the actual number likely exceeded 200, with many deaths classified as accidents to avoid scrutiny. The crisis peaked in December 1945 when 5 prisoners at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, hanged themselves within a week after receiving Soviet zone repatriation orders. The War Department issued Emergency Directive 411 on January 15, 1946, requiring suicide prevention protocols including confiscation of belts, razors, and rope. Agricultural communities across America documented their advocacy for retaining German POWs. Camp Concordia, Kansas, developed such strong relationships with its 4,000 POWs that the town still hosts annual reunions. Wisconsin's Door County credited 2,140 German POWs with saving their entire 1945 cherry crop by picking 508,020 pails of cherries. In Texas, where 300,000 agricultural workers were needed, farmers grew so dependent on POW labor that they protested camp closures. The Spokesman Review reported cases of entire communities blocking roads when military police arrived to collect prisoners for repatriation. March 15, 1946. Pier 51, Staten Island. The Liberty ship General Sturgis waited to transport 1,500 German POWs to Bremerhaven. When buses arrived from Fort Dix, longshoremen found desperate men who had to be dragged aboard. The International Longshoremen's Association threatened strikes rather than participate in loading unwilling human cargo. Camp Shanks, New York, served as the primary deportation facility, built to process 1,000 prisoners weekly, but handling 5,000 by April 1946. On April 22, 1946, 30 prisoners scheduled for departure soared through barracks floors, attempting to escape through sewage pipes. 27 were recaptured immediately. 3 reached the Hudson River before Coast Guard patrol boats pulled them from the water. Navy records document 17 confirmed suicides during Atlantic crossings between March and July 1946, though deaths classified as accidents or missing at sea likely increased this number. Germany in 1945 to 47 offered starvation and ruin. Official rations in the British zone provided 1,040 calories daily, below subsistence level. The winter of 1946 to 47 saw rations drop further. Infant mortality doubled. Herbert Hoover reported 40% increased mortality among Germans over 70 in fall 1946. 20% of German housing was destroyed. The expulsion of 12 million Germans from eastern territories created an unprecedented refugee crisis. Industrial output in 1947 reached only 1/3 of 1938 levels. Food production hit 51% of pre-war per capita levels. For prisoners of war from Soviet-occupied zones, return meant potential execution or forced labor. The Red Army's occupation had resulted in an estimated 2 million rapes. Soviet authorities dismantled entire factories as reparations. Any German male between 16 and 60 faced possible deportation to Soviet labor camps. Congressional records from 1945 to 1947 reveal intense pressure from agricultural states to retain POW labor. The Office of Provost Marshal General limited food and ended canteen sales in May 1945, following civilian complaints about POW treatment. This triggered work stoppages among prisoners who saw their conditions deteriorating despite Germany's surrender. Officials justified extended detention by arguing that Germany's lack of functioning government meant formal peace hadn't been concluded, allowing detention under Geneva Convention Article 75. The creation of new classifications, surrendered enemy personnel and disarmed enemy forces, enabled continued labor exploitation while avoiding full POW protections. President Truman ultimately ordered completion of repatriation, despite agricultural pressure, though delays for harvest reasons extended into 1948. The last German POWs weren't returned from America until summer 1946, with many spending additional years in forced labour in Britain and France. The numbers tell the complete story. 371,683 German POWs held in America. 2,222 documented escape attempts. 7 prisoners never accounted for. 14,000 repatriations delayed for agricultural necessity. Approximately 5,000 eventually returned as legal immigrants. 580,000 Germans immigrated to America in the 1950s. 210,000 Germans immigrated in the 1960s. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 admitted 415,000 displaced persons by 1952, including 60,000 Germans. Many former POWs were among these numbers, though precise tracking remains impossible due to immigration record limitations. The economic impact was undeniable: 14 million man-days of agricultural labour, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labour value, 1940s dollars. 80 cents daily wage per prisoner, paid to US government. German POWs worked in 46 states, filling critical labour shortages. They built infrastructure, harvested crops, and maintained industries that would have collapsed without their labour. Communities that employed POWs often became their strongest advocates for retention. The Special Projects Division, the US military's secret re-education program, reached 40,000 German prisoners. The program published Der Ruf, The Call, a prison newspaper, and distributed books banned in Nazi Germany. After VE Day, 25,000 prisoners graduated from democracy courses, returning directly to Germany instead of facing additional labour in Europe. Camp newspapers, 135 published across various camps, reflected changing attitudes. By 1945, 8 of 20 camp newspapers still advocated Nazi ideology, but the majority had shifted toward discussions of democracy and reconstruction. Notable graduates included Walter Hallstein, who became president of the European Commission, Hans Kroll, later West German ambassador to the United States, and Rüdiger von Wechmar, German permanent representative to the United Nations. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 provided the first legal pathway for former POWs. Between 1948 and 1952, approximately 5,000 former German POWs successfully immigrated under various provisions. Requirements included American sponsors, proof of non-Nazi party membership, and means of support. Barbara Schmitter-Heisler's research, based on 35 interviews with former POWs, documents their integration into American society. Many became successful business people, engineers, and community leaders. Their children and grandchildren now constitute a significant portion of German-American families. After leaving America, German POWs faced additional years of forced labour. Britain received 175,000 German POWs who worked until 1948, with 25,000 choosing to remain as civilian workers. France received 740,000 German prisoners, keeping many until 1949 for reconstruction work. These extensions violated Geneva Convention requirements for rapid repatriation, but were justified as war reparations. The last German POWs weren't released from Allied custody until 1949, 4 years after war's end. Published memoirs provide documented evidence of POWs experiences. Louis Carlson's We Were Each Other's Prisoners, 1997, based on over 150 interviews, documents widespread desire among German POWs to remain in America. In the 1985 reunion in Austin, Texas, over 500 former prisoners returned to America. Their testimonies, preserved in archives, consistently describe better treatment as prisoners than they experienced as civilians in post-war Germany. Arnold Kramer, interviewing former POWs for decades, noted that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after repatriation. The transformation of German POWs from enemies to potential citizens appeared in multiple government reports. The State Department acknowledged that prisoners of war exposed to American democracy and prosperity became inadvertent ambassadors for American values upon return to Germany. Military intelligence reported that prisoners of war who worked on American farms often developed stronger loyalty to their host communities than to defeated Germany. These observations influenced later policies toward enemy combatants and displaced persons. While precise numbers remain elusive due to military suppression, documented evidence confirms hundreds of relationships between POWs and American women. The Immigration and Naturalization Service received over 3,000 inquiries from American women seeking to sponsor former POWs between 1946 and 1950. Most applications were rejected based on regulations excluding former enemy combatants from standard immigration quotas. However, approximately 1,200 former POWs eventually married American women, either returning through legal channels or meeting during later visits. Of 2,222 escape attempts from 371,683 prisoners, the 0.6% rate represents remarkably low numbers compared to POW escapes in other nations. Most escapees were recaptured within 24 hours. The vast distances, language barriers, and lack of underground support networks made successful escape nearly impossible. 7 prisoners remained unaccounted for at final repatriation. Besides Georg Gärtner, Kurt Rossmeisel lived as Frank Ellis in Chicago for 14 years before surrendering in 1959. The other 5 presumably died or successfully integrated into American society under false identities. Communities that fought to retain German POWs often prospered from their contributions. The J.R. Simplot Company, built partly on POW labour, became a billion-dollar enterprise. Agricultural techniques introduced by German POWs, particularly in irrigation and sugar beet cultivation, transformed American farming. Many former POWs who returned as immigrants became successful entrepreneurs. Their experience with American business practices during captivity provided advantages in post-war commerce. Several founded companies that became major employers in their adopted communities. The resistance of German POWs to repatriation influenced American Cold War policy. Their fear of Soviet occupation validated American concerns about communist expansion. Their stories of forced repatriation became propaganda tools demonstrating communist brutality. The principle that people fleeing communist oppression deserved special consideration, established during the POW crisis, became embedded in American immigration policy. This precedent influenced treatment of Hungarian refugees in 1956, Cuban refugees after 1959, and Vietnamese refugees in 1975. Of 511 POW camps across America, few physical remains exist. Most were converted to other uses or demolished. However, their impact on local communities persists through museums, historical societies, and annual reunions. Algona, Iowa, maintains a POW museum. Camp Hearn, Texas, preserves barracks and artwork created by prisoners. These sites attract descendants of both prisoners and guards, creating connections spanning generations. Historians consider the German POW experience in America among the most successful examples of transforming enemies into allies. Arnold Kramer's assessment that America won the propaganda war through sheer reality reflects scholarly consensus. The program succeeded because it demonstrated rather than preached. POWs witnessed American prosperity, experienced democratic processes, and received humane treatment. Their transformation from Nazi soldiers to democratic citizens occurred through observation rather than indoctrination. The last organized repatriations occurred in summer 1946, though individual cases extended years longer. Military records show 14,000 POWs had repatriation delayed specifically for agricultural work, technically violating Geneva Convention requirements. Ships carrying reluctant prisoners back to Europe reported widespread despair. Captain Harold Morrison of the Marine Phoenix documented hunger strikes, suicide attempts, and mass hysteria among prisoners convinced they were sailing to Soviet ports. Former POWs played significant roles in Germany's post-war reconstruction. They brought American agricultural methods, business practices, and democratic ideals. Their experience with American prosperity provided models for economic recovery. Walter Hallstein, educated at Fort Getty, helped design the European Economic Community. Hans Kroll, imprisoned at Camp Shelby, fostered German-American relations as ambassador. Rudiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, promoted international cooperation at the United Nations. The National Archives holds extensive records of German POW camps, though many documents remain classified or were destroyed per standard military protocol. Surviving materials include camp newspapers, photographs, and administrative records. Universities and historical societies maintain oral history collections from former POWs and American personnel. These testimonies, recorded before participants died, provide irreplaceable insights into daily life and relationships within camps. The POW repatriation crisis established several legal precedents. Johnson versus Eisentrager confirmed military authority over enemy combatants. The reclassification of POWs as disarmed enemy forces created categories still debated in international law. These precedents influenced treatment of combatants in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. Questions raised about forced repatriation, prisoner rights, and Geneva Convention interpretations continue affecting military detention policies. Academic research documents lasting impacts on communities that hosted POW camps. Towns that developed positive relationships with prisoners often experienced economic benefits from return visits and sister city relationships with German communities. Sociological studies found reduced prejudice and increased international awareness in communities with significant POW interaction. These effects persisted through generations, influencing local attitudes toward immigration and foreign relations. Military intelligence documented various resistance methods, destruction of identification documents, feigned illnesses requiring hospitalization, work slowdowns and strikes, trading classification categories, deliberate failing of democracy screenings, mass non-cooperation at departure points. These techniques, while ultimately unsuccessful in preventing repatriation, delayed the process significantly and required extensive military resources to overcome. The International Red Cross investigated conditions during forced repatriation, expressing concern about potential Geneva Convention violations. Their March 1946 report documented psychological trauma among prisoners facing return to Soviet-occupied territories. American military chaplains reported moral conflicts between following orders and protecting prisoners from likely persecution. Their testimonies, preserved in military archives, reveal deep ethical struggles within the repatriation system. The German POWs who resisted repatriation after World War II represented more than individual desperation. They validated American principles through their desire to remain. Their resistance emerged from rational calculation. They had witnessed American prosperity, experienced democratic processes, and compared them to the devastation awaiting in Germany. Of 371,683 German prisoners, 2,222 attempted escape, 7 disappeared forever, and approximately 5,000 eventually returned legally. These numbers tell a story of transformation, from enemies to potential citizens, from prisoners to residents, from defeated soldiers to democratic converts. Georg Gärtner's 40-year odyssey as America's last fugitive POW symbolizes this transformation. His successful integration into American society, despite living under an assumed identity, demonstrated that former enemies could become productive citizens. His 1985 surrender and subsequent citizenship in 2009 provided closure to a chapter that began in 1943. The economic arguments for retention, $230 million in agricultural value, critical labour during wartime shortages, conflicted with organised labour's demands for veteran employment. This tension reflected larger questions about American values, economic necessity, and international obligations. The documented relationships between POWs and Americans, resulting in approximately 1,200 marriages, challenged wartime prejudices and military regulations. These connections transcended nationality, creating bonds that survived decades of separation. Operation Keelhaul's forced repatriation of Soviet citizens cast a shadow over German POWs from Eastern territories. Witnessing these scenes convinced many that resistance offered their only survival chance. The McNerney-Clark Directive's authorization of force, without regard to their wishes, validated their fears. Fort Eustis's democracy screening program, processing 22,000 POWs through classification systems, created resistance rather than cooperation. The irony of teaching democracy while denying freedom wasn't lost on prisoners or observers. The devastation awaiting in Germany, 1,040-calorie rations, destroyed cities, Soviet occupation, made American captivity preferable to freedom. This reality drove suicide attempts, escapes, and organized resistance documented in military records. Congressional debates revealed fundamental conflicts between agricultural necessity and labor rights, between economic pragmatism and international law. The delay of 14,000 repatriations for agricultural work demonstrated economic interests overriding Geneva Convention requirements. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 finally provided legal pathways for return. Approximately 5,000 former POWs successfully immigrated, becoming citizens, business owners, and community leaders. Their integration proved that transformation was possible. The broader impact included 580,000 German immigrants in the 1950s and 210,000 in the 1960s, many influenced by POW experiences or connections. These movements shaped German-American relations for generations. Former POWs who achieved prominence, Walter Hallstein, Hans Kroll, Rüdiger von Wechmar, demonstrated that enemies could become allies through exposure to democratic values. Their contributions to German reconstruction and international cooperation validated American investment in their education. The preservation of camp histories through museums, reunions, and archives maintains connections between former enemies. Annual gatherings in places like Algona, Iowa, and Hearne, Texas, celebrate transformation rather than conflict. Historical assessment confirms that American treatment of German POWs, despite forced repatriation controversies, succeeded in converting enemies to democratic allies. The program's reliance on demonstration rather than indoctrination proved effective. The legal precedents established during the repatriation crisis continue influencing military detention policies. Questions about prisoner rights, forced repatriation, and Geneva Convention interpretations remain relevant in contemporary conflicts. The story of German POWs who refused to leave America ultimately transcends war. It reveals humanity's desire for freedom, opportunity, and dignity. These men, brought as enemies, discovered in America what they'd been told to destroy, a society offering hope despite their prisoner status. Their resistance validated American principles not through propaganda, but through desperate desire to remain. In choosing America over repatriation, they chose possibility over certainty, unknown futures over devastating pasts. They came in chains. Many fought to stay. Some succeeded. Their transformation from enemies to citizens stands as testament to America's capacity for redemption and renewal. The prison camps meant to contain them became doorways to new lives. The nation they fought against became the home they refused to leave. This is their documented story, verified through military records, congressional testimony, and historical research. It demonstrates that even in war's aftermath, transformation remains possible. Enemies can become allies, and prisoners can recognize freedom even behind barbed wire. The German POWs who refused to leave didn't just escape from something, they escaped to something. In that choice lies proof that America's promise transcends nationality, that democracy's appeal surpasses ideology, and that human dignity can survive even war's devastation. Their legacy lives in their descendants, in the communities that protected them, and in the precedents they established. They proved that America's greatest victory wasn't military but moral, the ability to transform enemies into citizens through the simple power of witnessed freedom.